Welcome to episode 67 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode at the show notes, which is www.7, all spelled out, so seven health.com/67.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. It's another solo show, and this week I'm talking all about stools. So a little while ago, I did a show all about urination, looking at how often you should be going and how different things can impact on this. And if you're interested, you can find that show at seven-health.com/56. It was a show that got a lot of feedback and a lot of comments, so I thought I would give the same treatment to stools. So as part of the show, we're going to look at what stools are and what role or purpose they're serving within the body. We'll look at how regularly you should be passing a stool and some of the characteristics of healthy stools versus things that should maybe make you re-examine either your digestive health or other areas of your health. I'll be touching on digestion as well as just other miscellaneous ideas all relating to the topics of stools. So to start with, let's look at what is the point of passing a stool. So a stool is a mixture of a lot of different substances, and most people probably think of it as just being made up of food that hasn't been broken down properly, but it's actually much more than this. So the majority of a stool is actually made up of water, and this is probably around about 75%, something like that. And I'm going to talk about consistency side of things with stools later on, but just for now, remember that water makes up a large part of it. Stools also contain bacterial biomass. So this is dead bacteria that helped us to be able to digest our food, as well as living bacteria that is in our gut and is now making its way out of the body as part of it. It will contain carbohydrates, indigestible fibre, and plant matter. And this should be pretty difficult to identify if you're looking at your stools. Like, you don't want to be seeing bits of lettuce leaves or tomato or have things that are very readily identifiable. But plant matter will make up a decent percentage of the stools. Well, at least if someone's eating plant matter, it should be making up a decent percentage of the stools. They will also contain some protein and some fats, but ideally this should be in pretty small amounts if digestion is working as well as it should be. It will contain dead epithelial cells. So these are the cells from your gut lining. So the lining of both your small intestine and your large intestine, they're turned over very regularly. You're wanting very fresh cells and new cells there. So the older ones are constantly being removed and they make their way into the stools. And finally, as part of stools, like, they contain waste products from detoxification and largely from your liver. So lots of the substances that your liver breaks down goes into a substance called bile, and that bile is stored in your gallbladder. And bile is useful, A, for putting waste products into from your liver, but B, is also needed as part of your digestion in helping to digest fats. So when you eat a meal that contains fat, we release bile, and that helps to emulsify and break down that fat. So some of that bile then gets reabsorbed and comes back into the gallbladder and stays in the body, while some of it makes its way out of the stools and is excreted. So within that bile, the liver will put things like detoxified hormones. It will put dead like bacteria or fungus or viruses, old broken down red and white blood cells. Like, really, the list is pretty endless. And so all these substances then go together and create the stool that then gets excreted from the body. And for a lot of these substances, you want to be removing that stuff fairly promptly. So you don't want hormones or other detoxified substances that are in your stools to be then sitting in your body, largely in your colon, for very extended periods of time. Like, what can start to happen with these substances is they can get reabsorbed out of the colon and get back into your bloodstream. And this substance then has to be processed again, which is a huge burden for your body, but your liver in particular. And it's not just broken down substances from your liver that you want to worry about. You don't want proteins or other parts of food continuing to putrefy in your colon, and this can cause problems. And so you're really wanting to get this stuff out of your body and doing it pretty regularly. So that then brings up the next idea, which is how often should you be passing a stool? If you look up the information or this question from a medical perspective, the typical advice is that as long as you're going at least once every 3 days, that this is fine. So you are not considered constipated, or it's not considered abnormal unless it's less than once every 3 days. So from my perspective, I really disagree with this. And it's not just that what I think there's a fair consensus on this stuff. Like, really, you should be going once a day. If you're going every other day, if you're going every 3 days, things aren't working really as well as they should be. So once a day should be the minimum, and probably going somewhere between 1 to 3 times a day is around about ideal. In theory, you could be going more than this and it's fine. So you could be going 4 times a day or 5 times a day and it'd be fine. But often in practice, what I find if and when people are going much more frequently than 3 times a day, or even more frequently than 3 times a day, there's issues with consistency with their stools, or with inflammation, or to do with stress. So I'll cover some of these in a little bit, but as I said, 1 to 3 times a day is probably about right. And let me explain the frequency side of things a little bit. We have within the body a thing that is known as the gastrocolic reflex. So this is a completely autonomic and involuntary response that impacts on the movement or motility of your gastrointestinal tract. So when you eat a meal and this meal first enters into the stomach and it begins to stretch out the stomach, that stretching out of the stomach creates a chain of events, and it actually creates a peristalsis, which is movement in your large intestine or your colon. So even though the food is only in your stomach and nowhere near the end part of your digestive system, it actually triggers motion in that area. So that motion in your colon then propels the formed stools towards your rectum. The stools then reach the rectum and then stimulate the anal nerve plexus. And this is what then sends you that signal to say you need to go to the bathroom. And hopefully you then heed that warning and go relieve yourself. So in theory, anytime that you eat some food, this gastrocolic reflex gets turned on and it can then start that chain of events. But what typically happens is it's normally the size of the meal that has more of an impact. So the larger the meal that you just had, the larger of the impact it has in terms of turning on that symptom and making it more likely to cause a bowel movement. So this is why going 3 times a day and that those motions happen, say, 15 or 20 minutes after a meal can be a fairly normal part of digestion. And I know not everyone follows a pattern like this. So some people, they may follow some kind of pattern. So it will be that, for an instance, that every morning they will go. But it might not be after every meal. It might be just once a day. For other people, it can be completely random. And there is no pattern of when they normally go. It just happens at some different points. But I think understanding that gastrocolic reflex is at least part of the reason why there is that recommendation that you should be going sort of once, twice, maybe 3 times a day. So how much you then should go in terms of actual amount, this is a little bit more difficult to find information on. People don't talk about this quite as much, possibly because most people aren't like weighing or measuring their stools. I do remember, like in Paul Chek's book, How to Eat, Move and Be Healthy, he recommended that you should be passing 12 inches of stool a day. I don't know what research that figure came from. I had a look in the book. I couldn't find any link to the research about that. I found an article online, and then this one article was then quoted a lot around the internet that every day you should release 1 ounce of excrement for every 12 pounds of body weight. So this would mean that if you are a 160-pound person, you should produce just under a pound of waste every day. And I actually found the original article that this came from, but the link to then the original source was dead, so I have no idea how true this is. On Wikipedia, it states that the average daily amount of stool passed is 128 grams a day, which is much closer to a quarter of a pound, so obviously much less than the previous suggestion. But again, there was no link or source connected to that comment on Wikipedia either. So the size and weight, I don't really have any concrete figures. The figure from Paul Chek that he quoted feels probably in the right kind of ballpark, but I think it really does depend on the individual. So the next idea is looking at shape and appearance of the stool. And to help talk about this, I'm going to reference a thing called the Bristol stool chart. And this was a chart that was developed by the University of Bristol to help patients more easily be able to talk about stools with their doctors. And obviously, if you can look at this chart while I'm talking about this stuff, it would make it visually much easier. But I know this is a podcast and most people are out and about when listening to this, or they're doing something else like cooking or whatever it is, and probably won't be looking at this while I go through it. So I'm going to explain it so you don't need a visual aid, but at some point I would suggest checking out the Bristol stool chart. If you Google that, it'll come up really easily, and you can then just have a look at the pictures to help go alongside what I'm saying now. And one thing that I do want to add, and I probably should have said this at the start when I first started talking about the different characteristics with stool, is that you should be looking back in the toilet to see what comes out. There is so much information that you can learn by paying attention to your stools and actually viewing them. And you may think that this is disgusting or something that kids do, but really everyone should be doing it. And so hopefully with everything I'm going to go through as part of this episode, it can help to enlighten you or help you discover how much information you can glean from this, and you can then start to do it. So getting on with the Bristol stool chart. So it's a chart that runs from 1 to 7 with 7 different types of stools. And it's not always going to be so easily split into just these simple categories. And say in one bathroom chip, there may be a combination of different types, or you may find that you're falling somewhere between 2 different categories. But despite this, I do find that the different types are an easy way of talking and thinking about this stuff. So starting with type 1, it kind of goes from most constipated to most loose as we go through the different types. But starting with type 1 is where you have very hard separate pellets or hard lumps, and they can be hard and abrasive and often painful to pass. If this type of stool is happening fairly regularly and it's not just a one-off or sporadically, it really increases the chance of anal rectal bleeding. So you may see like blood on the paper when you're wiping if you're constantly getting this kind of stool. This kind of stool is common often with people who are under eating and there just isn't enough bulk and there isn't enough calories coming in to create normal sized stools. It can also be happening a lot alongside constipation. So people can be skipping days and days alongside then having more pellet-like stools. Other reasons that this one can happen is antibiotics. So for a couple of days after some antibiotics, this can be the result. And I know that can also go the other way as well. So after antibiotics, people can have a tendency towards more loose stools, but this is one of the things that can happen after antibiotics. It can be common if someone is having a very fiber-free diet, so something like a very low carbohydrate diet, especially something like, say, the GAPS diet or the specific carbohydrate diet in the very early stages can push someone more towards this kind of a tendency. It can happen also a little bit more with dehydration, but if I'm thinking about dehydration on its own, if someone is eating a fairly normal mixed diet, if they're eating enough food, dehydration would be more likely to create one of the other types of stools that I'm going to go through, maybe more like a type 2 or a type 3 than the type 1. So moving then on to the type 2. So type 2 is a sausage shape, but it is very lumpy. And it's kind of like if all of the pellets from type 1 compacted together and created one single mass. That would be what a type 2 stool would be. And one of the biggest issues with this type of stool is it can be really painful to actually move the bowels. And this is because the stool is normally very wide in diameter. And this width can then be wider than the opening of the anal canal. And because these pellets that have been kind of squished together to make this one big stool are so hard, it can be really difficult to pass. There can be lots of straining. It could lead to either cuts or tears of the anus. So again, you can be getting some of that blood on the paper when you're wiping. It can be leading to hemorrhoids if this is a very common type of stool that someone is having as part of their day-to-day. This type of stool is also pretty common with constipation, so similar to type 1. It can also be common with people who have a tendency to suppress the urge when they need to go. So if they're out and about, if they're not at home, like if they only like to use a certain toilet or even be in a certain place and they constantly hold on, I think there's a much more tendency for this to happen. And what happens is because it's not getting out, it's staying in there longer, it's becoming larger, it's becoming more dried out. And all of this then leads to a more difficult experience when it comes time to actually go. So type 3 is sausage shaped but has some cracks on the surface. And this is kind of like version 2, but a more scaled down version. So it's similar, but it's more narrow in diameter. So it's going to be easier for the person to pass, but it can still be linked into a bit of constipation, or if not constipation, just a slower than ideal transit time. Straining is probably still needed to move this type of bowel movement, this type of stool, sorry. And so from number 3, you then go on to number 4, which is a thin sausage or snake and is smooth and is soft. And this is really very easy to pass and is the ideal for a healthy stool. And unless you are going every day, it's unlikely that you would have a type 4 and above. It's more likely you're going to have a type 1 to type 3. So type 4 is when someone is going at least once a day. They can be going multiple times a day, and it's easy to move, it's soft, it's smooth. And as I said, this is the ideal. Type 5 is where you have small, soft blobs, but they have defined edges. So this is still very easy to pass, but not getting to the stage yet where there's a real sense of urgency that things could just happen and it's going to get really loose and get quite messy. This type of stool is probably more common with people who are going multiple times a day. So if you're going multiple times a day and things are in a good place, it's more likely to be a type 4 or a type 5. And I would say that while type 5 is probably not completely ideal, this is probably the second best option of all of the different types. It can point a little bit towards more of a need for fibre, or that something is irritating the bowel or anywhere along the gastrointestinal tract, or it could be indicating towards a sped up transit time. But this isn't, none of those things are guaranteed. And so, as I said, a type 5 can still be pretty okay. Type 6 is where you have fluffy pieces with really ragged edges, or it could be just this very mushy stool that then becomes one big mound of stool in the bowl once you've passed everything out. And here we're getting back into a stool that isn't so great. And this is definitely associated much more with an urgency and an urge to go, where someone gets that call of nature and they really do need to be near a bathroom, otherwise it can get a little messy. These types of stools are often associated with hyperactivity within the colon, so where someone has a really quick transit time from when they eat to it coming out the other end. This type of stool is a little bit more likely to be having undigested food in it, and you can get undigested food all the way along the different types, but I think it's more likely to be having it in higher amounts when you're getting into something like a type 6. It can also be associated more with certain substances that can trigger this type of stool. So rather than this be a regular event, there's something that sets it off. So for example, if someone has alcohol, or if they say have too many spices, can be the stool that they get. Acute stress can also be another factor that would lead to this kind of stool. So in these cases, this type of stool is much more transitory rather than someone's regular type. And then the final type on the Bristol stool chart is type 7. And this is a stool that is watery and has really no solid pieces. And there may be pieces of food in there, but there's no solid pieces of stool. And this is what we would typically refer to as diarrhea. And so this can happen during a bout of illness, whether that be something like food poisoning or a bacterial or viral infection that actually has nothing to do with what someone has eaten. It can be associated with different types of bowel diseases. So things like diverticulitis, irritable bowel syndrome, or celiac disease. And often with these types of bowel issues, people really alternate between constipation and diarrhea. So sometimes it's a type 1 or a type 2, and there are like days and days between them passing a stool, and then other times they're at a type 6 or a type 7 and they're going multiple times a day. So that is the Bristol stool chart and the different types of stools. And something that I did touch on, but I want to explain a little bit more, is in terms of how it feels to actually pass a stool and the straining or no straining and that kind of thing. And really, if things are working well, when passing a stool, you really shouldn't be noticing anything going on. You should be sitting on the toilet and it should just be coming out very naturally. There shouldn't be any straining. It just shouldn't take any real effort for it to come out. And so, look, at one end of the spectrum, you don't want it to be like a panicked run to the toilet and things are just flying out. But at the other end, you don't want to be sitting on the toilet where you can read a whole article from the New Yorker or like a whole chapter of a book. It should be a pretty quick experience that is completely painless and free of straining. On the smell front, this also should be pretty minimal. Like, in no way should your stool smell like roses or Marc Jacob perfume or anything like that, but it shouldn't be extremely foul smelling. And extremely poor smelling stools or smells from stools that then linger and stay for 20 minutes, half an hour, that kind of thing, really points towards things like gut dysbiosis. It can be linked into constipation. It could be pointing towards different intolerances, but that's something that points towards something not working so well. It could also point towards a high amount of certain foods within a diet. So diets that are high in protein, particularly animal proteins that have high amounts of methionine, which is a precursor to lots of the sulfur-containing compounds, they can be pretty punchy on the nose, and so it can be coming from that side of things, from a very high protein and animal protein diet. As a slight aside, there was actually a really interesting section of a Tim Ferriss podcast when he was talking with a guest called Eric Vance, and Eric Vance was talking about a story that he'd covered as a writer, all about research being done into pigs and how they can make their excrement less smelly and less stinky by changing their diets. And pig farms have a really hard time getting approval because of the smell. And the research was trying to find ways that they could change their diet so that the smell wouldn't be so bad, so they could get more pig farms to be having licenses, etc. It was a really interesting podcast. So if you want to check it out, you can. The bulk of the episode has nothing to do with pigs. It was actually all about placebos, just so you know. But I'll put a link to it in the show notes, but I just thought I would mention it. Another thing I want to mention with this stuff is in terms of the shape of the stool. And it's that the diameter of the stool doesn't have to be completely round. Like your anal canal is actually more flat than round. So if the stool is soft, like a type 4 as it should be, it's more likely that the stool is going to be more flattened than to be perfectly round. On the color front, healthy stool should be brown. And the color comes from the bile, which I mentioned earlier on, is needed for the digestion of fats and is put into your stools as part of excreting that stuff from your liver. And it is pretty normal to have some variations in color. And this could be due to certain foods. So it could be more green if you've eaten large amounts of salad or you've had a green smoothie. It could be more purple if you've had some beetroot. It could be darker black if you've been having lots of Guinness. It can also link into other health issues. So, for example, you're having more pale or very yellow stools. It can link into really a range of different things. It could be to do with your liver, to do with pancreas. It can be to do with parasites. So there's lots of different reasons why it can be that color. If it is red or it is black, this could link into bleeding. And this is something you really should get checked out. I think for the other changes in color, I'd say it's not something to be worrying about if it's every now and again, as long as it's typically brown. But if you are seeing really dark stools and you haven't been having things like beetroot or Guinness or something that's coloring them, or you're seeing that they're more red and there's like visible blood in the stool, this is something that I would go and get investigated. And hopefully it's completely benign and there's nothing wrong with it, but it can be linking into things that are more serious. So it's something to get checked out. There's often the question of whether your stool should float or sink, and really healthy stools can do either. And it actually links more into the macronutrient compounds or component of someone's diet. So typically the higher fat that someone is having in the diet, the more likely it is going to float. Higher amounts of fibre and carbohydrates that then someone includes in their diet, the more likely it is going to sink. So neither of these things are good and bad. It just depends on your diet. I would say, though, if it is going to float and it is because you're eating a higher fat diet, there shouldn't then be a film of oil on the toilet water. Like if this is then happening, it's showing that fat digestion is impaired and this is something that should be dealt with. So I've spent a lot of time talking about things you can look out for from stools and looking back in the bowl. I now want to just cover some other ideas relating to stools and the questions that people have around this stuff. And I think the first one is looking at fibre. And fibre is one of those substances that always comes up in discussions around stool health and gut health. And if people are constipated or are having trouble moving a stool, they're told that they should increase their fibre content, that they should eat some all-bran cereal, or they should take a fibre supplement like Metamucil. And the theory is that fibre provides the stool with bulk, and by having then some all-bran, it's going to get things moving. What I've actually found in practice is that the best thing for helping more regular bowel movements is, one, making sure that someone is eating enough and that there is enough food coming through to actually be creating proper bowel movement, And then the second part of that is, once we know that is happening, making sure that they are having ample amounts of fruits and vegetables. And really the fiber and the plant matter from fruits and vegetables has much more of a profound and beneficial impact than the fiber from grains or cereals or beans, from my experience with clients. And one thing or a couple of things I would say this is there are certain clients who don't do so well on certain vegetables and they may react to them. So from a specific front in terms of the vegetables, like my leaning is much more towards root vegetables, and I find that these can be very helpful with creating stools. And if someone's not having regular stools, getting them to increase this just on its own can be very beneficial. And with above ground vegetables, having things that are cooked really well. So often overcooking them to start with and making them pretty soft. And this won't necessarily be the way that they have to eat them forever, but it does help in the beginning in terms of digestion and with stool regularity. On the fruit front, I think people should be having not just things like dates and prunes, which is often the fruits that people think of, but having really all fruits across the board. And like with my comments with vegetables, the same thing applies to fruit. Not everyone does well on everything. I normally get clients, if they're having apples and pears, to be stewing them, because I find that if having them raw, it can be a little bit more problematic for some people from a digestive perspective, and having things like stewed fruit can be really good for stools. If people are having other fruits as well, making sure that they are really ripe. And so if you're having bananas, don't be having them with bits of green on them. Have them so that they've probably got some little black spots on the skin. Or if you're having some apricots or some peaches, they should be really sweet. They shouldn't be hard and tart. And really having fruit across the board that is very ripe and is very sweet is going to be better from a digestive perspective, and creating that plant matter that is so helpful for people. And I would say this not just from a digestive perspective, but from a health perspective across the board. And so before someone starts reaching for the high fiber cereal, I'd suggest them upping their fruit and vegetables and seeing if this helps. And there can obviously be lots of other reasons for why someone is constipated, but if I'm thinking from a fiber perspective, fruit and vegetables from my experience really trumps grain fiber. I've mentioned in passing earlier when talking about stool types about transit time. And so for a healthy individual, the transit time from when you eat something to when that thing then passes out of your body as a stool should range for somewhere between about 24 to 48 hours. And you can test this yourself to get a vague idea by eating corn. So eat some corn on the cob, or eat a tin or some of a tin of tinned corn. It doesn't really matter. I mean, digestively as humans, we aren't great at being able to break down corn, and it's typically one of those foods that you'll actually see in your stool. So you can eat some corn and then see how long it takes before you then see that corn in your stool. So is it the next day? Is it 2 days? Is it more than this? And that can give you at least a little bit of an idea into your transit time. Something I also want to mention is just the link between gut health and then the health of other systems within the body. So, for example, residing in your gut is your enteric nervous system. So the enteric nervous system is often referred to as your second brain. So most of the same chemicals that are found in your brain are also found in your digestive system. So chemicals like acetylcholine, dopamine, serotonin, and research is starting to show that if you have problems within your gut, it can then be affecting the messaging within your brain. And just like you have your nervous system residing in your gut, you also have your immune system residing in your gut. So, for example, throughout the small intestine, you have lymphoid areas known as the Peyer's patches. And these areas are where large amounts of your immune system reside, and they really have a dual role in these areas. So one part of it is about your immune system actively doing surveillance duty and taking care of any nasties that shouldn't be there within your body. And then the other part of it is facilitating the education and the generation of immune cells based on what they are seeing. So in a sense, the Peyer's patches are like schools for your immune system, and the health and the function of your gut is dictating what lessons are being taught and what kind of students that school is then producing. So both on the immune front and also on the nervous system and brain front, a healthy gut is really important. And where the stools then come into this is they can be a pretty good sign of whether things are working well or not. Because when things aren't working well, you don't always get this message so clearly from gut symptoms. So things can be going really badly wrong in your gut, but for most people, they're not going to get pain in that region. Sometimes they'll get some gas or some bloating, but again, this isn't always the case. So stools can be a really good indicator where other feedback systems aren't happening. So if you're getting, say, brain fog, anxiety, depression, ADD, or other mood disorders, there could be an issue between your gut that is affecting your enteric nervous system and your brain. If you're suffering with asthma or allergies, if you're getting skin conditions like rashes or acne or arthritis or joint pain or migraines or other inflammation, there could be an issue in your gut that is affecting your immune system. And obviously, for all of these conditions, there can be numerous different causes, but this is just something worth keeping in mind when you're then paying attention to your stools. So another idea I want to mention is to do with the anatomy of your body and the best position for actually passing a stool. So from an evolutionary perspective, sitting on a toilet is a very recent thing. Outside of this very modern change, it's probably been a couple hundred years at most, we've previously always been in the squat position with our knees much more elevated and closer to our torso. And when we're in this squatting position, it actually opens up the rectum and the anal canal properly, making it much easier to pass a stool. So for those people who struggle with straining or difficulty passing a stool, or really anyone that just wants to make the process much easier on the body from an anatomical perspective, I would suggest being in a squat position when you pass a stool. And the easiest way to do this is actually to get a little footstool that you can put on the floor in front of the toilet that you can then put your feet on to raise your knees up and put you more into that squatting position. And you can buy a thing online called the Squatty Potty, but you don't have to. You can easily get a shoebox or something similar that you can then just put in front of the toilet that you can put your feet on to then get yourself into that proper squat position. And if I'm then thinking bigger picture, sitting long periods of time in general isn't great for our digestive system, especially the large intestine and especially in regards to our stools as well. So there's been loads of research coming out about the benefits of standing more and using things like standing desks or walking desks. And one of the big reasons why this is so beneficial is to do with digestive health. And this is important for everyone, but I'd say especially for those who suffer with constipation or suffer with hemorrhoids or some type of colon disease or pelvic floor issues. And for pelvic floor issues, this probably includes most women who've had kids, at least to some degree. And so moving from just standing, looking at then exercise, exercise when done properly for where someone's health is at really does help greatly with digestive health and with regular stools. But if people are taking exercise to the two extremes, whether that is doing absolutely nothing or very, very little, or doing way too much of it, it can create a problem. So if someone is doing too little exercise, they're going to get the same issues of someone who is sitting too long, which from a stool's perspective is much more likely to create constipation and going very infrequently. So obviously someone can be completely sedentary and they can have reactions to certain foods that make them much more frequent, or they'll be having loose stools as opposed to the constipation type symptoms. But on the whole, under-exercise and being sedentary seems to promote constipation and the associated issues with that. And then at the other end of the spectrum to do with exercise, if you have someone who is over-exercising, this can affect stools and it can be a little bit mixed. So for a lot of overtraining, especially things like running, this typically leads to much looser stools and often diarrhea. So transit time seems to really speed up. You can get much more watery stool with undigested food particles as part of it, and that can be pretty common. And you can get a real urge to go and the resulting loose stools, often while someone is training. So they'll be out for a long run or trying to go out for a long run, and they'll really get that urge when they are out running. But they can also get that looseness that happens outside of just those moments of intense exercise. And obviously it's not just running, it can be any type of intense exercise, but it is a little more common with something like running. And with over-exercise, it can also lead to constipation or much slower transit time. I've worked with numerous clients who were overtraining and under-eating, and they found that they were rarely going. And I've also worked with people at the other end of that spectrum. So I'm not really sure what the difference is and why someone ended up with constipation and why someone ended up with loose stools or diarrhea. But it really can happen with both ends of those spectrums if people are over-exercising. And I'd make the same comments around stress as well. For some people, stress sends them like running to the bathroom more frequently, while for others it leads to constipation and then not going for days and days. And I made a point recently on a podcast that I was recording about stress that diet isn't always the remedy for your health issues. And I'd say the same thing here in terms of diet isn't always the remedy for issues with passing stools, especially if stress is going on. And having someone who is stressed eating a better or a healthier diet may do very little to impact on their stools, because the current factor that is making the most difference to them and causing that problem is really the stress. So learning to see when something is diet related and working on this is going to help, and seeing when something is non-diet related and knowing that they need to work on that instead. So another area to do with stools would be to do with testing. So maybe you are paying attention to your stools and your digestion in general, and you're noticing that things just aren't right, and you started to make some changes, but the problems are still persisting. If this is the case, you can get a stool test done. And so you buy a kit from a laboratory, you then collect a stool sample or a number of stool samples, and then you send it back to them and they analyze it. And if I'm being honest, I don't actually run these tests that often with clients. Number one, they aren't the cheapest things to do. And I often find that if we're using a food log and if people are paying attention to their diet and other lifestyle factors, and we start to play around with things, we can normally make the improvements that they're after without them needing to do a stool test. But there are times when we're doing that kind of stuff and things are still lingering and they're just not improving as much as they would like. So we do run a test, and in these instances, it can be really helpful. So they will look at different substances in the stool, so they are able to estimate how well different parts of the digestive system are working. So they can comment on, say, how well your pancreatic enzymes are working, or how much fat or protein you have in your stool, so they can look at how that's going from a digestive perspective. It can look at the bacterial makeup of the stool, so commenting both on the beneficial bacteria as well as the potentially pathogenic bacteria. It can look at parasites and fungi and protozoa and all types of microorganisms that can be potentially creating a problem. And with any of these organisms that they do then find in the stool, they will then test different drugs and different herbal remedies against these organisms, and they'll test the things that are normally known to do well against those things, and then they're able to give a rating of how well that substance worked against that particular microbe or microorganism in a petri dish. And so it can then give you some idea about, if someone has that issue, what are the things that are most likely going to be helpful. And so I do find that these stool tests can be useful in the right circumstances. The company that I use for these tests is called Genova, and they actually have a number of different stool tests. They have the CDSA 2.0, and then the GI effects, and that's just ranging in the oldest, which is the CDSA, to the most recent, which is the GIFX. And you can choose with all three of these whether you want to have them look at parasites as well. And they all range in different prices. Some are better for certain things than others. So normally what I will do is I will pick the one that is best for the symptoms and the case history the client is presenting with, but also looking at their budget and what they're able to afford, because as I said before, they're not always the cheapest tests. One thing I should just mention with this is that while the stool test can give really good information of digestion through the gut, the focus is largely on the colon and the large intestine. So over the last couple of years, one of the big health issues that people are often talking about is SIBO, or small intestine bacterial overgrowth. And this can be when you have dysbiosis in the small intestine. So in an ideal world, the small intestine should have some bacteria, but it is should be a fairly sterile place in comparison to the colon. And what happens with SIBO is that it starts to have much higher amounts of bacteria in that small intestine, or sometimes the bacteria that should be residing in the colon start to make their way into the small intestine. Something like a stool test isn't going to be able to diagnose this for you. So instead, you need to do a breath test for this thing, for SIBO. And what the breath test does is it is looking for hydrogen and methane, and it's performed after you fast for 14 hours. You then take in a substance, a liquid substance called lactulose, which is a type of carbohydrate that these bacteria, if they are in the small intestine, will start to ferment, and this will then cause the gas that is then detected as part of the test. So I know that was slightly off topic, but I just wanted to mention it. If you've heard of SIBO and you were thinking about going and doing a stool test, you shouldn't do it because it's not going to show anything for it. So the next thing I want to mention is to do with a woman's reproductive cycle and how this can affect stools. And this is most frequently going to occur like just leading up to a woman's period or during the actual period, but can also happen around ovulation. And these are times in which there are sudden changes in hormones, particularly estrogen and progesterone, as well as other hormone-like substances, so prostaglandins. And for some women, this can lead to constipation, and for other women, it can lead to looser stools. And what I would say with this is that some changes in stools around these times is fairly normal and really isn't something to worry about. But if the changes are more significant, or they are happening alongside a host of other physical or mental or emotional symptoms, then this is probably where it needs a little bit more attention. And when I say attention, this can simply be making a little bit of changes to diet or lifestyle and seeing what happens, or it could involve some kind of hormonal testing to see where different numbers are at and what could possibly explaining the different symptoms that are happening. And like I said, with the stool testing, this is something that I'll only do if the changes that we're making to someone's diet and lifestyle aren't yielding the improvements that they want to see. And when we then can do those tests, it just gives us another level of information. And I do find that the hormone testing can be helpful, but again, it's not the cheapest and it's also not always needed. So another common thing that people mention around stools and gut health in general is to do with probiotics and prebiotics. And this can be taking in foods that contain healthy bacteria in terms of probiotics, or eating foods that the gut then ferments and creates its own healthy bacteria in terms of prebiotics. And this can be foods or it can be in supplemental form. And on paper, I think both of these are really good ideas, and I actually encourage clients to be eating a lot of these things, but I always pay attention to how they actually work for that person, because there are certain gut issues that when you add in probiotics or prebiotics, it can then make things worse. And it's not because these things are bad, it's just because of the reality of where someone's bacterial picture is in terms of their gut at that time, and where they have certain microbes and how high those microbes are in numbers and where they're residing within the gut. And these substances can then just make things a little worse. So this could point to a situation in which testing could be useful to find out why this is happening. It might be worth trying different types and seeing if you get the same reaction. So trying a different brand of yogurt or kefir or a different brand of probiotic supplement and seeing if it's still getting the same issue. Or it might be worth just focusing on other things for the time being and later on retrying these substances and seeing if they're still creating the problem or if they're now being helpful. And so I am a big advocate of probiotics and prebiotics, especially from a food perspective, but sometimes they don't help in the way that someone hopes or expects they will. So the final thing I want to mention before wrapping this up is the long-term problem with holding in stools on a regular basis. So there's always going to be times when we get the urge to go, but we just can't. So we're in a meeting, we're driving somewhere, you're on a bus or a train, like there are numerous situations where you just simply can't go immediately. But what I see as being a big problem is when people are suppressing the urge to go when it simply isn't necessarily, and they're doing this very regularly. So someone has decided that they never use public toilets and so have to wait until they're at home in the evening. Or someone who won't use the work toilet so they suffer the same fate. Or even just someone who is just so busy and they feel that they don't have time to go right now, so they just continue to suppress the urge and do that on a regular basis. And this continued suppression of the urge to go with time can actually damage the nerve in the anal nerve plexus. And so what happens with time is that urge to go at all just rarely happens. And in a sense, you train the body to not hear the feedback and to basically become constipated. So with clients like this, or really any client with consistent constipation that doesn't improve from dietary changes, I make a couple of suggestions. So the first is that if on the rare occasion they do get the urge to go, they need to go as soon as humanly possible. Like, don't further cause problems by suppressing it. But the main thing that I suggest is actually giving their body a chance to go on a regular basis. So for people like this, I'll often find that because they aren't getting that urge or that feedback to go, they rush around in their normal everyday life, never giving it a proper chance. So for these clients, I actually suggest that 3 times a day, preferably after they've eaten a main meal, so that 15-20 minutes after a meal, or maybe even a little bit shorter after, they should go and sit on the toilet as if they need to go. So they ideally can then get that footstool to then put their feet on so they're in the right position and they're more in that squat position, and just sitting there and seeing what happens. They shouldn't be straining or pushing. They should just assume the position and see what happens within their body. And I suggest that they sit there for 5 or 10 minutes, and if they want to, take a book, something like that, scroll through Facebook, Instagram on your phone, but stay there for 5 or 10 minutes. And if nothing happens, they can then get up, they can go and continue on with their day. Then after the next main meal, they should come back and do the same thing again. And what I find is that when people do this consistently, if they do keep it up, they do start to have regular bowel movements. And not only does it start to happen, but they over time start to get that urge back, and they start to get that nerve message back that has been really missing for them. But I mean, for this to really work, it has to go hand in hand with someone stopping the suppressing of the urge to go when they're out and about. So they have to be okay with using public toilets or toilets in restaurants or toilets or work or whatever it may be. Because if they only allow themselves to go when they're at home, then this rarely improves things. And so this also means keeping in mind what I mentioned about the fact that we often get the urge to go after we've eaten a meal. So if you eat your breakfast at home and then you rush out the door, you're probably missing that opportunity that your body needs to go. And this doesn't mean that you should skip breakfast at home and only eat when you get to, say, the office. But I would be aware of the physiological effect that eating can have on your bowels and see how you can work out the best solution by giving yourself the opportunity to then be able to go after a meal. So that brings us to the end of this show. I've now been officially talking about stools for, 40, 50 minutes, something along those lines, which has got to be some kind of record. I mean, at least for me anyway. My hope is that you found this information useful, and really the big thing I want you to get out of this is that you should be paying attention to your stools. They can give you a huge window into your health, and not just digestive health, but health in general. So if you don't already do it, make a habit of looking back in the toilet after you go. Check out the Bristol stool chart that I mentioned earlier on, so you can see what it looks like from the description that I was using, and start paying attention to your stools. So next week, as always, I will be back with another show, but have a smashing week, and I will catch you then.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.